Flashpoints, a brand new bi-weekly collaboration between Flashpoints and ConsortiumNews.com. On our maiden voyage this week, we feature articles on the limits of Elizabeth Warren, an update on the dangers of Russiagate frenzies, and we'll feature a retrospective on former UN Chief Kofi Annan, who passed away last week at age 80. I'm Dennis Bernstein with Consortium News Editor-in-Chief Joe Lauria. All this coming up straight ahead on Flashpoints. Stay tuned. And welcome to Consortium News on Flashpoints, a new bi-weekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. I'm Dennis Bernstein, executive producer of Flashpoints, with Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of ConsortiumNews.com. Well, welcome, Joe Lauria. Nice to have you here. It's exciting, a collaboration where we bring two different alternative news sources together. One radio, one print, and sort of increase our power. Welcome.
Thank you, Dennis. Really, really happy to formalize this relationship. I know that you had Bob Perry on, the founder and editor of Consortium News, on as a frequent guest. I've heard many of those interviews over the years. So Bob would be pleased if he knew that we were formalizing this into this biweekly format. We do have something in common. I think you're absolutely right. There are a few media outlets that are covering the kinds of stories that are ignored by the mainstream media that we do at Consortium and that you do at Flashpoints. And if it is covered by the mainstream media, we take a different angle. And Bob, before he died in January, wrote his last piece, which is quite a testament. It was a lament about what has happened to American journalism. He grew up in an era where there were some very basic principles, basically journalism 101, telling both sides of the story, using the word alleged when there's only an indictment of someone, and keeping to rules like that are being increasingly ignored and cast aside as journalism sinks deeper and deeper into mainstream journalism anyway, into partisanship. And that was another key part of Bob's work at Consortium News and as a journalist for AP and Newsweek was to be totally nonpartisan and to stick to principles and facts. And we see today, particularly in this Russiagate story, where the hyper-partisanship on both sides of this story are further denigrating journalism. It's great to be able to bring this alternative point to your show, to this show together. I'm going to bring my own long experience in corporate journalism to bear on this, to keep Bob Perry's site going the way he started it.
Well, that's beautiful. We're, of course, excited as well. A wonderful new bi-weekly collaboration we're going to have with Consortium News. We have worked with Consortium News since its founding as a, first in paper and then one of the first investigative sources on the web. It's been going on. We loved working with Bob. We are glad that you're picking up the work from him. The work isn't easy, but it's great, important, and we will continue to do it. All right. Well, let's just dive right in here, Joe. Let's talk about the first edition, what we have coming up. I think the first story we'll be doing today has to do with, the limits of Elizabeth Warren. It's a piece by Sam Hussaini. Why did you think that's a significant piece to put on, Consortium?
Well, we've become known for being quite hard on the Democrats, maybe harder on them than we are on Republicans. It could be because, coming from the perspective we feel betrayed in some ways by, as many people on the left are, by the Democratic leadership. And Elizabeth Warren was a great hope at one point, and she's still quite a great voice on banking and finance and those issues, and she's made her mark, certainly, on those matters. But, she was a very big disappointment when Bernie Sanders was running in 2016 that she did not endorse him in the Massachusetts primary, which may have put him over the top. And she held back and, of course, supported Clinton. And this was a great disappointment for many progressives, real progressives, that even in and out of the Democratic Party. So Warren is now on the Armed Services Committee as well. So it's not just banking that she's dealing with. She's dealing with military matters and finance military matters. So Sam Hussaini who is a denizen of the National Press Club here in Washington, was at her press conference, and as Sam usually does, he has a pointed question to put at newsmakers, and he asked her about a statement that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said. This is the woman, of course, who won the primary against Joe Riley in New York, who is, again, now a great hope of progressives in and out of the Democratic Party, and where those of us who are excited about her primary victory hope she'll make it to the House of Representatives and will stick to those principles, one of which was she said that the money that is being spent on the military should be slashed for social good, for social programs. This is a long-standing progressive position, but rarer and rarer, as we see in the Democratic Party, almost non-existent now. And Sam also asked her about a bill that's gone through Congress that has to deal with supporting children in Palestine. And, of course, Warren waffled. She gave a very non-committal answer. I think it seemed that she seemed trapped. It sounded as a woman who is in the system and needs to depend on the system to survive and needs to get reelected, etc., but knows better but can't say. And I think that was a classic situation of a politician in that situation. So Sam wrote up a piece that I edited and put online, and I think it's very appropriate for Consortium News to take a look at that issue in this way.
Well, we're also going to hear from Patrick Lawrence, and he deals with an issue that, probably helped to rush Robert Perry into his grave, and that's dealing with Russiagate, the Russiagate frenzy, and leak versus hack. We spoke with Patrick Lawrence. Obviously, you think that's an important story to keep up with, one that Bob was devoted to.
Well, no question about it. Russiagate has come to define Consortium News. Our analytics show that, without question, the most popular stories we publish deal with Russia and the Russiagate issue. And many people come up to me now after I've taken over this position to tell me how much they came to rely on Bob Perry's pieces and on the site in general, because there are others, including myself, who, before I took over, wrote about Russiagate for Bob, about how they immediately went to Consortium to see what the analysis was of the latest, when there's a big development in this ongoing saga. So Patrick Lawrence took the opportunity, after 1 year of the memo published by the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, probably after their first one, and that was in 2002, in the lead up to the Iraq War. They wrote a memo. They write memos to the president in which they make an argument. That's not common in the mainstream press. In 2002, it was about why it was a bad idea to invade Iraq. Now, this was started, the VIPs, as it's called, by Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, who's a frequent guest on your show, Dennis, and Bill Binney, who I think has probably been on your show too, who's a former technical director of the National Security Agency. These are two heavy-hitting former intelligence officials. I mean, Bill was really at the top of his game at the NSA, considered by many to be one of the best, if not the best, mathematician ever to work at the NSA. And he devised many of the systems that still are being used by the NSA to conduct electronic surveillance. And, of course, Ray McGovern used to brief two presidents, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He gave the morning briefing from the CIA inside the Oval Office. So in that spirit, they continued briefing the president, if you will, by writing these memos. And since its inception, VIPs, the depository of all their memos and where they're first published is Consortium News. So that was an alliance that Bob Perry had with Ray and Bill Binney. So a year ago, in July of 2017, they came out with a very powerful memo which claimed that an analysis of the download speeds and the transfer speeds overseas made it impossible for Russia or anybody in Europe to actually have hacked the DNC's computers or servers, and that the download speeds from the metadata that was published by this mysterious figure, Guccifer 2.0, show that it had to be a download from onto a hard drive or a thumb drive locally. And so a year later, a retrospective on that and some new information was included that Patrick will be telling you about.
and Joe Lauria. We're also going to speak to you about Kofi Annan. He recently passed away, controversial figure. He has been attacked and praised, a Nobel laureate. Why do you think it's important to think about his history, his background? Why did you write about him initially in the Boston Globe and now a piece in Consortium News?
Well, that was the Boston Globe article that I wrote when he was leaving office in December 2006, just a couple of days before. It was personally important to me because my background is as a UN-based correspondent for 25 years, and I knew Kofi Annan quite well. He was the most personable of all the Secretaries General that I covered, and I covered 4 of them. And he is a particularly complex figure, and I think it's important because it deals with the issue of U.S. dominance at the UN and the conflict that Kofi had between serving the U.S., which put him into his position as Secretary General, and also representing his constituents in Africa and other developing countries, since he was the first sub-Saharan African to lead the UN. So when we get a chance to talk about that, I'll expand on that, Dennis.
Beautiful. All right. Well, again, very exciting, Joe Lauria, collaboration here now with ConsortiumNews.com, Consortium News on Flashpoints. You are listening to Flashpoints and Consortium News on Pacifica Radio. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints, a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. Joining us now to talk about his new article on ConsortiumNews.com, The Limits of Elizabeth Warren, is Sam Hussaini. Sam Hussaini is an independent journalist, senior analyst at the Institute for Public Accuracy, and founding member of VotePack.org. You can follow him at Sam Hussaini. Sam, welcome to this new collaboration.
Great to be with you, Dennis.
Well, it's good to have you with us. And before we jump into your visit to the National Press Conference and Elizabeth Warren, last we heard from you on Flashpoints. You were in a bit of trouble. You just had been dragged out of the July 16th Trump-Putin news conference in Helsinki. You were locked up in the middle of the night. What happened?
First off, I think I have to apologize to your listeners because I think the interview I did with you folks was one of the earliest, and I don't think I'd slept for 24 hours.
You did a great job.
So, well, basically what happened was I got to Helsinki and got into the news conference accredited by the nation and wanted to ask a tough question about the nuclear ban treaty, which 122 countries voted for a year ago. The group behind it won the Nobel Peace Prize. I also wanted to ask about the influence of Israel. Everybody talks about the influence of Russia, in particular the fact that successive U.S. administrations have refused to acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal. And so I wanted to ask Putin and Trump about why they're blocking this worldwide effort to genuinely get rid of nuclear weapons, and Trump, if he would end right here and now the U.S. policy of refusing to acknowledge the empirical reality of Israel's nuclear weapons. And, how do you do that? So, you try to use whatever tools you can in the toolbox of journalism. And I thought, we thought, my colleague Norman Solomon and I came up with the idea of, well, why don't I hold up a piece of paper? Because Trump had been making noises, as presidents sometimes do, about getting rid of nuclear weapons. So I wrote up a little sign that said nuclear weapon ban treaty. And somebody, I think, another journalist told the authorities that I had this sign. And long story short, they ended up literally dragging me out of the news conference just while I was trying to explain that I wasn't protesting. I just wanted to hold up the sign during the news conference very quietly to just see if I could get them, Trump or Putin, to call on me.
Well, they weren't, obviously they weren't open to even a sign about that. There was extreme order there in a nation that claims to be, to celebrate free speech. But we're glad that you took the risk, and journalists have to push the limits in any way that's available. I want to direct you, because really what we're going to talk about has a lot to do with the same kinds of limitations of the flow of information, particularly having to do with foreign policy in the United States and Western Europe. So, Sam, your new article, The Limits of Elizabeth Warren, gets into this. You tell us, set the scene. You were at a recent press conference at the National Press Club with Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's a leading Democratic contender for president. Just set it up for us.
Well, she had this news conference where she laid out portions of a series of anti-corruption statutes that she's putting forward. And I talked to some financial experts about it, and some of them were impressed by at least parts of it, not only trying to end or at least severely limit the revolving door between government and business, but also parts of her proposal seem to restructure companies so that they have workers and others on the boards, similar to what takes place in Germany. I was a little torn. Part of me wanted to ask, about the specific things about what the emphasis of her remarks were, but other people were asking other things, and I thought it incumbent upon me to ask her, questions about foreign policy, about why will she join other incoming Democrats to severely cut the military budget? Will she back a bill that's in the House to defend Palestinian children from getting mauled by Israeli snipers and such? I just, very banally almost asked those questions. And what struck me was, the incredible specificity and passion and knowledge that she brings to talking about financial reform issues, which isn't to say that she isn't limited in some ways. I mean, she was recently on CNBC, and she was like, "I'm a capitalist. I love markets." So I'm not necessarily totally agreeing with everything that she says there. I'm just reporting on it. But her specificity and her passion and her connecting the issues and so on when it comes to financial shenanigans suddenly disappeared when I asked her about foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, at that press conference, she was very tough, for instance, on former Representative Billy Townsend, right, who was cozied up to Big Pharma, and got a good gig after he resigned. She was tough on some of these folks, but that toughness, that specificity, you're saying, disappeared when it came to key issues of foreign policy. And how can you make room for health care if you've got a massive military budget, right? That's part of the point here.
Yeah, that's certainly part of the point. If you're not willing to talk about the elephant in the room, just at a banal level is the cost, aside from the moral and the strategic and other issues with having such a gigantic military, and the human issues and so on, just simply the amount of money that's poured into it and how it deforms the economy as a whole. You'd think that she might have an interest, and she's on the Armed Services Committee. She noted, I'm on the Armed Services Committee. I've seen the sausage made, and I want to give you a system-wide response. And it just struck me that her response was, while it had some truth in it, certainly, I think that if you got money out of politics, it would have ramifications.
So she did a song and dance, really, and danced around the issue of foreign policy. Right. And what else came up around that?
Yeah, on foreign policy, and in particular to this bill to defend Palestinian children. I was basically asking her to do what incoming and current Congress people are already doing. I wasn't. It was a very moderate ask in that sense. But what was remarkable was, she talks about the wealthy and the connected being able to pull the strings of power. But part of the way that they do that is that they get answers to their questions. If they raise a concern to a politician, that politician can't give a vague answer to them. And that's, in a sense, what she was doing when I raised these issues, giving, vague, non-specific answers is not a prelude to a politician who is, who's on the Armed Services Committee, who's been a senator for over 5 years, and, presumably has formed opinions, but somehow can't bring themselves to say, yeah, I would want to cut the military budget, or why she wouldn't want to do so.
You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints, a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. My name is Dennis Bernstein. We're speaking with Sam Hussaini. He's an independent journalist, senior analyst at the Institute for Public Accuracy, and we are talking about his new article on ConsortiumNews.com, The Limits of Elizabeth Warren. Now, let's put this in the context of, this is a real problem. Bernie Sanders was a major disappointment, again, like Elizabeth Warren, let's be honest here, when it came to foreign policy. He either jumped on the bandwagon or hid under the covers when those major questions arise. Absolutely.
The most pointed time came to me was right after the attack in Paris. And the very next day, they had their debate on CBS. And, of course, the first question, totally predictably, was about the Paris attack. And it was, this great opportunity to lay out a critique of general U.S. foreign policy and how it feeds into violence there and violence in, in Western capitals as well as in the Middle East, and the human carnage that results from a militarized foreign policy. But he didn't do that. He, said one or two perfunctory things, about, solidarity with the people in Paris, and then wanted to talk about income inequality, which he can speak of in a very passionate, very knowledgeable, very precise way. Exactly what Elizabeth Warren was doing in terms of financial corruption. And that's a non-answer. It's not only bad ethically, in my view, to not being able to scrutinize things that affect the lives of other people on the planet. I think it's also really bad politically, because, at some level, even your, greatest supporters, when they hear that right after, when, a foreign policy, I don't want to say incident, a really serious foreign policy affair happens, and you can't step up to the plate and give an analysis of it, that's not a serious candidate at some levels. I think Sanders was, unfairly treated by the establishment, by the media establishment, the Democratic Party establishment, and so on. But, he's still responsible. And he ended up doing some negative things in terms of foreign policy during the campaign. He's gotten somewhat better since, I think, but still highly problematic. But another low point came when Sanders talked about, we need to straighten out the Middle East. The Saudis have got to step up and get their fingernails dirty. He's calling for more Saudi intervention in the Middle East.
He didn't have a clue, right? He really didn't have a clue.
I hope it's that he didn't have a clue. I think it might have been worse than that, but, you can't get inside people's heads. But what he was saying was, in effect, something that would and has made the situation worse. The Saudis, have gotten their hands plenty dirty, most obviously in Yemen, but also elsewhere. They're committing, carnage. And he, eventually, came around to some meaningful criticisms of Israel, but it took quite a long time. And I think that it's still limited in some ways in how he criticizes Israel and how he criticizes the U.S. as well.
When you talk about, again, when you talk about the Saudis, just recently we saw this horrific bombing of these kids. 44 kids murdered 53 people. 44 kids murdered 53 people altogether in one shot. And now it's confirmed that the bombs that landed on that school bus of kids wanting to, I think they were heading for camp or something, was manufactured in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's good that I think CNN finally, put out an investigation on that. But the outlines of it have been known and decried for several years now. And any change that we can get from that is welcome. But it's extraordinary to me how long this war, this attack on the people of Yemen by Saudi Arabia and the U.S. and the UAE. I mean, the U.S. has really been totally on board with this from the Obama administration.
And of course, these are details Bernie Sanders needs to understand. If he didn't, that slaughter being led by the Saudis could not happen in the way it's happening unless the United States was up there in the air refueling planes. So it's an extraordinary problem. All right. Well, thank you, Sam Hussaini. Sam Hussaini is the author at consortiumnews.com of The Limits of Elizabeth Warren. He is an independent journalist, senior analyst at the Institute for Public Accuracy, and he's the founder of votepack.org. Sam Hussaini, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Dennis.
And you are listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints, a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoint show and consortiumnews.com. Stay tuned. You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoint show and consortiumnews.com. I'm Dennis Bernstein. Patrick Lawrence. He's a correspondent abroad for many years, chiefly for the International Herald Tribune. He's a columnist, essayist, author, and lecturer. His most recent book is Time No Longer, Americans After the American Century. His piece that we're going to be talking about is called Too Big to Fail, Russiagate 1 year after VIPs showed a leak, not a hack. And it appeared August 13th. Patrick Lawrence, welcome to Flashpoints.
Thank you very much, Dennis. It's great to be the first in a delightful idea, a program between Consortium and KPFA. Pleased to be here.
Well, it's good to have you with us. Now, you refer to VIPs, which is Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And they're a group of seasoned former members of the U.S. national security state, you have to say, various agencies. And they have an alternative view of what's been going on in terms of the Russiagate frenzy. And the point that they've been making is they're saying leak, not hack. The controversy is, was it a leak? Was it information released by folks who were very troubled by the Clintons and the way they treated Bernie Sanders? Or did the Russians take over the U.S. election? And that's what you write about. Maybe you can begin, though, by talking about Russiagate frenzy and whether you think this has taken us perhaps to a new version of the 1950s McCarthy era.
Right. Well, Dennis, I have argued with friends or spoken with friends for a long while now about the similarities between our moment in the 1950s. I have had some resistance. No, Patrick, nobody's jumped out a window yet. Nobody's lost a job and so on and so forth. Setting these particulars aside, I think we are right back there. I think that was an extremely damaging period to many of our national institutions, and we're doing it again. If you go through these, I'm a pressman, so starting with the media, has done astonishing damage to itself by indulging in unbalanced reporting, omission, false equivalences, what have you, right? The Justice Department and certain law enforcement agencies controlled by it, the intelligence apparatus. I do not think that there's any question of these institutions returning to anything we might call normal once they accomplish their apparent objective, which is to get Donald Trump out of office. I think the damage has been perhaps permanent, and that's why I called the piece "Too Big to Fail." If this Russiagate narrative collapses, it's just incalculable what the kind of cataclysm that will occur in our public sphere. The investment these institutions have made over the past year astonishes me. I mean, completely without caution, right? And they've led us to a kind of brink. One wants the truth to come out, right? Bob Perry used to say, "We don't care what the truth is, we care what the truth is," right? That's where we are, and trying to imagine what will happen when the truth of Russiagate emerges, and it may be a long while. It is just I can't reckon up what it would be like.
You know, I remember as a sort of a police beat reporter, I would talk to crooked cops who, you know, just shot somebody or somebody died in strange circumstances, and the response would be, yeah, well, he may have not done this one, but he did the 10 before this one, so he deserved to die. And that seems to be the tone, Trump at all costs, and it seems like the major cost could be truth.
It looks like it to me. I mean, the single most important thing VIPS did last year was bring the conversation around to a point where evidence was on the table. No evidence had been on the table prior to that. We had various intelligence agency assessments. That's a very tricky word in the intelligence community. It means our best guess, right? We had numerous special investigations on television. Associated Press ran a huge one, the Times, needless to say, the Post, and so forth. None engaged this question of evidence. What VIPS said last year was very simple. We have evidence now of what happened. If you want to continue discussing this matter, come forward. With supporting evidence, good. With countervailing evidence, also good. You have countervailing evidence, we will help you, Bill Binney indicated to me on the telephone the other day. They're not traveling with an agenda here, Dennis. They're after the truth of what happened. And we have had a year of flinching from this very raw fact. There's evidence now. What about it? Nobody has a good answer to that question yet.
You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints, a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. We're speaking with Patrick Lawrence. He's the author of an August 13th article on Consortium News, Too Big to Fail, Russiagate, 1 year after VIPS showed a leak, not a hack. Now, you mentioned Bill Binney. He's a very important player here, and he knows as much about all of this as anybody in this world. You want to talk a little little bit about who he is and what he's been saying.
Yeah, Bill was for many years the NSA's technical director in charge of global analysis. And he was also the designer of the programs the NSA continues to use to monitor Internet traffic. He knows how they work down to the most granular detail. I think Bill's starting point was very simple. If Russia was in any way involved in supposedly hacking email from the Democratic Party or John Podesta, the NSA of necessity would have to have that evidence. They haven't produced it. But he went on from there with the help of various forensic scientists, and they demonstrated two things last year. One, the transfer, what is called the transfer rate, the speed at which data was copied, that could be measured in the metadata of the stolen documents. It turned out to be 22.7 megabytes of data per second. I don't want to get your listeners lost in detail. Simply said, that was way too fast to be managed over an internet line, I will underscore, at the time. It couldn't have been done over an internet line at that time. Bill experimented subsequent to their publication on July 24th of last year. He went on to months and months of further investigation up to this past spring. They confirmed their findings. Indeed, they found it less possible than they thought at the beginning. So the transfer rate is absolutely the essential core piece of evidence. It couldn't have happened. A moment ago I said, at that time. Many people, perhaps some of your listeners, made the mistake of saying, I can do that from my living room sofa. Maybe they can now because the exceptional pace of fiber optic technology development is such that it's all different. At that time, it was not possible. Okay, as I've come to think, if the incidents in question had taken place maybe 6 or 8 months later, we might not even have this evidence. But they took place when they did, and we do have this evidence. If I may go on to a second point.
Please do.
They also concluded that they could identify the time and location of the copying operation. They had it East Coast time zone, and they had it at various times. I can't remember precisely the times, but they pinned it down. That evidence is now in question because this past May, one of the forensic scientists working on this discovered that the entity known as Guccifer 2.0, who claims responsibility for all this, was manipulating as much of the metadata as he, she, or it could. He, she, or it manipulated the timestamps, the time zones, the dates, everything, using various different algorithms. Suddenly, Guccifer 2.0 was quicksand. I mean, there was no certainty as to what could be relied upon as emanating from this entity, right? There was one thing he couldn't alter, the transfer rate. That is inarguable. No one has come forward to contest it. So VIPS has said recently, McGovern told me, I think it's in the piece, that a mistake was made in giving equal status to the time stamps and location of the operation. Those are no longer clear because Guccifer 2 is now identified as a manipulator, right? A manipulator of as much data as he or she or it can, right? We already knew previously that Guccifer 2.0 had inserted Cyrillic characters into some of the documents. I think there were 5, purposely, right? We knew that. VIPS believes that was done by way of a program the CIA just recently developed called Marble, and by way of Marble, documents can be manipulated and footprints can be left pointing to anyone the agency may wish to point to. So we knew that much. But what we're left with now is considerable uncertainty about much of what we learned from Guccifer 2, except for one thing, the transfer rate. It comes down to that. It hasn't been knocked over. I wouldn't have written that piece if I thought otherwise. You work with these people for a long time. As any journalist will tell you, you judge your sources. Do I rely on them? Do I think they know what they're talking about? Are they sound? Do they have agendas? I stay with my sources, every one of them.
All right. Well, Patrick, let's conclude where we came in. The implications of depending upon, shall we say, faith and belief over reason, which could get us into some real trouble. You want to just reflect on this as we begin to wrap up?
It's a favorite topic, actually. The old word was fideism, the privileging of faith over reason, okay? I find, I'm not a professional historian, but I find time and again that we Americans are given to this over a long period of time, going back to the 17th century and the Puritan landings. I look at what we are up to now, every possible effort made to refute the truth of the Russiagate story, with one exception. No one will approach the question of evidence. No one. Why is this? I think because people have a need to believe that that the Orthodox account is true, precisely for the reason I alluded to before. If it's not, this is a very great thing to watch fail in front of us. It's almost unimaginable. I think we're looking at a moment of very considerable historic significance by way of the fate of our institutions.
That's the voice of Patrick Lawrence. He's a correspondent abroad many years. He's reported for the International Herald Tribune. He's a columnist, essayist. His most recent book is Time No Longer, Americans After the American Century. Patrick Lawrence, thanks for joining us.
You're quite welcome, Dennis. I wish the program well.
All right. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
You're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoint show and ConsortiumNews.com. And we turn our attention now to an article that appeared initially in the Boston Globe, now on ConsortiumNews.com. It's by the editor-in-chief, Joe Lauria, now running Consortium News. Joe, welcome to Flashpoints. Why did you think it was important to talk about Kofi Annan? He did just pass away. What's at the heart of the matter for you here?
Well, there's personal reason for me because I covered the UN for a quarter of a century, 4 secretaries generals. I started at the tail end of Perez de Cuellar, and then Boutros Ghali, Kofi Annan, and Ban Ki-moon. And of all those 4, I had the most personal relationship. Wasn't very close, but he was the most personable of all of the secretaries general. So I was a bit moved by his death, and it was unexpected. But more important than that are the issues that I raised in this article, or I raised when I wrote this in December of 2006, the few days before Kofi Annan left after his 10 years at the helm of the UN. And I took an angle in that story that I have not seen in anything that was written about Kofi when he left or now in any of the obits. And that was the central conflict in his time at the UN between serving the interests of the United States, which put him into office, and serving the interests of his constituents, Africans and others from developing countries. Kofi Annan was the first sub-Saharan African to lead the UN. He felt an obligation to support them, and I think it was genuine on his part. But he also, like all the secretaries generals, going back to the first one, have had this dilemma between the superpowers and the rest of the world. And whether you represent the interests of the peoples of the world, as the UN Charter begins, or whether you support the powers, the great powers. Without question, the best Secretary General of all time was Dag Hammarskjöld. And why? Because he was fiercely independent. He stood up to both the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. He said, and I quote, "The discretion and impartiality required of the Secretary General may not degenerate into a policy of expediency." He said at the time the Soviets were trying to get him to resign, he said it's very easy to resign. It's not so easy to stay on. It's very easy to bow to the wishes of a big power. It's another matter to resist. And resist, Dag Hammarskjöld did. It could have cost him his life. A piece I wrote in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, based on a UN commission, said that it's very likely that the CIA and the MI5, the Domestic Intelligence Agency of Britain, were behind the death of Dag Hammarskjöld in the plane crash that took place in Congo. And I say MI5 because Rhodesia was right next door, and Rhodesia was actually part of British territory at the time, so that was a domestic intelligence service. So Dag Hammarskjöld may well have paid with his life in an assassination because of his independence. So that sent a message to the other secretaries generals, and we saw with Boutros Ghali, again, I think the one who became the most independent and standing up to the U.S. He writes, we know this because he said in his memoir that he told Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, that Washington was his problem. And she responded, "You're our problem." He writes in his memoir that growing up as a young diplomat and being trained, he understood, he thought that the U.S. had a great diplomatic service. But he came to learn as Secretary General, like the Roman Empire, the U.S. had no need for diplomacy, but only to push its way around the world. So Boutros Ghali, because he tried to stand up to the U.S. and represent the peoples of the world, including Africa, where he came from, he was axed. He got vetoed. The U.S. vetoed his second term. So he's the only one of the Secretary Generals who've not served 2 terms. In came Kofi Annan, who was certainly America's choice, and he was nominated and, of course, approved by the Security Council. Now, Kofi had been in the UN system for a long, long time. The only one, in fact, that came from within the system. He had been head of peacekeeping, for example, and that's when I first got to know him in the early 90s at the UN. He got involved in a very controversial issue when Roméo Dallaire, the French-Canadian UN general who was in charge of the UN peacekeeping force in Rwanda in the summer of 1994, sent a cable back to UN headquarters to the peacekeeping department headed by Kofi Annan, saying, I need a few thousand men and I can stop an impending genocide. That cable never got to the Security Council. Kofi Annan was blamed for that, but he was able to overcome that and become Secretary General. It informed him, it informed his ideas later on, however. So Kofi became, according to Ed Luck, used to be, may still be at Columbia University, but I quote him in this piece, that Annan became too obsessed with Washington for his own good, and that he recommended that he should stop obsessing with the United States, and that when, by going along with the U.S., he upset his base in Africa and in developing countries, and then he would turn back onto the United States. So he was constantly going between these two forces that were tearing at him. The real moment that came for Kofi Annan that ticked off the United States was in an interview with the BBC just after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. He told the interviewer, who was insisting on an answer to the question, was the U.S. invasion of Iraq illegal? He had ultimately, in this interview, admitted, yes, it was illegal, because it did not have UN authorization from the Security Council, nor could the United States prove that they were acting in self-defense. And these are the two, because Iraq had never threatened the United States. These are the only two ways under international law, if anyone cares about that. The only way you can go to war is if you are being attacked and you're acting in self-defense, or if you get the Security Council to agree. Now, of course, the Bush administration went to the Security Council. If they should get the resolution, great. If not, they were going to do it anyway, and of course, that's what happened. They didn't get the resolution, and they invaded. Kofi Annan's life became hell then. The oil for food scandal that broke afterward was blamed by the United States mostly on him, when that was actually the fault of the Security Council itself, as all Security Council members are on the sanctions committees whenever the UN puts sanctions on a country. So they make these decisions, not the Secretary General. And it was French, Russians, and others, private individuals, and some people in government who had taken money out of this escrow account that the UN set up after the 1991 Gulf War, when the UN and U.S. sanctions remained on Iraq all the way up until after the death of Saddam Hussein in 2004. The sanctions were killing up to 500,000 Iraqi children. And if you remember, your listeners might remember, Madeleine Albright, interviewed by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, was asked if it was worth it to pay that price. And infamously, Albright said, yes, it was worth it. It was worth the deaths of 500,000 children in Iraq to contain Saddam Hussein. Those punishing sanctions, the worst probably in history, that certainly were hurting the Iraqi people more than Saddam living in his palaces. They tried to alleviate some of that suffering with this food for oil program, where Iraq could sell some oil. That money would go into this escrow account at the Paribas Bank in France, and then out of that money, the UN would buy humanitarian aid and deliver it to Iraq. But that scandal really paid Kofi Annan paid a big price for that, because John Bolton began to really started to attack him. It was all over the fact that he'd called the invasion of Iraq illegal. And towards the end of his time as Secretary General, in his farewell address at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, on December 11th of 2006, Kofi Annan said this, that no nation can make itself secure by seeking supremacy over all others. And he said that the institutions of the world could not really accomplish much when the U.S. remains aloof. Now, this is the kind of language of Dag Hammarskjöld or Boutros Ghali. So he, on the way out, he gave a parting shot to the U.S. So I think he was troubled by this need to support the U.S. and also support the peoples of the world. There was one other thing I should bring up that relates to what happened with him and Rwanda. He became, Kofi Annan did, a big champion of what is later became to be known as responsibility to protect. The UN Charter is very clear that the UN cannot interfere in the internal affairs of any nation. That had been sacrosanct when I got to the UN. But after Rwanda, and Srebrenica to some extent, a massacre in Bosnia during the war in the mid-90s, there was a move to go beyond that restriction to allow the UN to intervene in cases where there were imminent or ongoing massacres leading up to a genocide. Kofi Annan, some people believe, I think, because of his conscience of what had happened in Rwanda, supported that measure. That's the same with Madeleine Albright, who later, even in an interview with me later after she left the UN and after she was Secretary of State, told me how badly the Clinton administration felt because they didn't act to intervene in Rwanda to stop the killing. Samantha Power wrote a book about it, of course, and won a Pulitzer Prize. She later became UN ambassador. I covered her very closely, and she was a big proponent of responsibility to protect. What that is that the UN could put together a coalition of forces and intervene directly in the internal affairs of a sovereign state, including in a civil war, if there's real intelligence that a genocide is about to happen or is ongoing. And, on paper, that sounds great. It sounds great if they go in and stop the killing and then leave. This is the policy they invoked in Libya. There was an imminent massacre going to happen in Benghazi by Muammar Gaddafi and his troops. So the NATO had to intervene with the United Nations authorization, and they got that authorization. Russia supported it, which was later seen by Putin as being a big mistake. That was Medvedev, who was president at the time, who agreed to that. And the Libyan operation is a good example of what goes wrong with this responsibility to protect, and what many people believe is only a cover for intervention, and to have other motives, hidden motives, not just to go and stop a killing. We know in Libya now from a British parliamentary report that there was no imminent massacre. It was all a lie. It was made up. And that's clear from this British report. So why did the NATO intervene?
That's the voice of Joe Lauria. He is now the editor-in-chief of ConsortiumNews.com. He's talking about an article he initially published in The Globe back in 2006. It's about Kofi Annan. Now it's republished on Consortium News in the context of the passing of Kofi Annan. He died last week at aged 80. And before we say goodbye, by the way, you're listening to Consortium News on Flashpoints. This is a new biweekly collaboration between Pacifica Radio's syndicated Flashpoints show and ConsortiumNews.com. Just before we let you go, Joe, what was his response to the fact that the United States bugged the United Nations leading up to the Gulf War to try and figure out who would the opponents be of the invasion and how to undermine them or threaten them? Did he have any response to bugging the UN?
No, not really. No one did. People were pretty cynical about that at the UN. The answer you got was everybody's bugging each other. But, certainly the big powers were. I don't think he was pleased about it, but he did not make an issue of it, no.
No, I just bring it up because everybody's talking about the Russians and everybody and, bugging and all that and how dare us and all. So we're all holier than thou, but not much was said about bugging our opponents there, the United Nations.
No.
All right, well, we're going to leave it right there. Joe Lauria, pleasure to have you again on Flashpoints. We appreciate the work and the reflection on Kofi Annan. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Dennis.
And that does it for another edition of Flashpoints. Our executive producer is Dennis Bernstein. Senior producers are Kevin Pina and Miguel Gavilan Molina. Technical director is Mike Biggs. For more information about the show, to listen to or download archived episodes, log on to flashpoints.net. For questions or comments about Flashpoints, you can contact Dennis at dennisjbernstein@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.